So in this video, I'm going to talk to you about the EU AI Act. Now, it's always worth starting with what position your school is already in. So whoever's watching this, are you using AI in your work this week? Do you think ChatGPT is allowed in schools in the EU? Do you know the rules about using AI in education? Now, most people at the minute, at the time of recording this video, are probably answering no to this. So I just thought I'd try and go over my interpretation of all of these changes and just share it with people. So it's worth understanding that, like I say, I'm based in the UK. The EU AI Act doesn't actually apply to my schools, but I do work with some schools in the EU. So I've made sure I had to read it and understand it for them. So it is the world's first major AI law. So this is a a huge development, and you've got to take your hat off to the EU for doing this. And I think a lot of other countries are now catching up, and I think they'll go in a similar direction. There might be some amendments, but I think on the whole they're going to follow a similar suit. And the aim of the EU AI Act is it applies to a lot more than schools. So I'm just looking at it from the school's perspective here, but it's trying to protect students from harmful AI. It makes AI use transparent and fair. But it clearly doesn't ban AI. It is quite strong in some areas, but it's trying to encourage safe use, not saying no use. And it's actually been around since February 2025. It's just the expectations on people in terms of the law, it scales up. So there's only certain things that have been in effect since the minute it dropped, and then others you've got a little bit longer to get things in line. So going over it, in terms of the legal requirements, so the first off is AI training. So it's now mandatory that all staff receive appropriate training in a school in the EU around AI. So that could be annual refreshers as well and things like that. It's mainly AI literacy training that is required. They need to understand the systems and how they work if they're using them. There is a little bit of prohibition compliance. So there's certain types of AI systems that are completely banned, and they are right to be banned. And I'm actually not aware of any schools actually using any of these systems, but there are systems being developed that could do things like track emotions or track engagement, and those sort of things are not going to be allowed in EU schools, quite rightly. Then we've got a little bit longer to do some of the other bits of the EU AI Act, things like the high risk AI oversight parts. Now, luckily, a lot of the schools I'm aware of and work with already are doing this, so that's fine. But it's just making sure that the systems as you bring them in get categorized, and it's making sure that there's human oversight on all of the ones that could have or are classed as high risk in terms of the impact of those tools. I'll go into this a little bit clearer later. We've also got to have the appropriate risk assessments on any AI tool you use in your school. You've got to risk assess it in terms of where the data's going, what the impact might be, how it works, that type of thing. And then there's the transparency aspect. So you are now legally responsible on a certain level to be transparent around your AI use. And that is, if you think of that in terms of students and parents, that's quite a complex topic, and I'll come on to that later. And the last bit is just making sure that we all understand that this goes hand in hand with other laws that already exist. So things like GDPR, this is in addition. So there might be something that is okay technically in the EU AI Act that is not okay because it's a breach of GDPR and vice versa. So the 6 sections I'm going to go over today is the AI literacy fundamentals, the classification system. I'm going to link it back into data protection. Then I'm going to do some role-specific guidance, some stuff on transparency, and then implementation and support. Now, these are hopefully all useful, but I will highlight that the first one is the longest, and then they get shorter and shorter. The last few are only a couple of slides each, so please bear with me. They're not all going to be as long as this first bit. So, section 1 is AI literacy. So there's now a requirement that staff understand this stuff, so I thought I'd do a bit so you get a flavour for what sort of level I think it's important people understand. So first off, it's understanding how AI works. So it's understanding that AI is, as I've mentioned in other videos, it's a pattern matching um, type of brain, not understanding in the traditional term. Although you could argue that our brains, you know, the synapses get stronger and things like that, and maybe we do work in a very similar way. But AI, if you feed it the wrong information, like a human, it can output very wrong information, and it's understanding that that happens. And you know, real examples I've put, AI might say Paris is the capital of Italy if that pattern appeared in the training data. It can state things that are fundamentally false, and you need to understand that. It also doesn't understand context, sorry, in the way humans do. So a great example is there was a video of a Tesla driving down a motorway, and it kept noticing traffic lights, and like, you know, you're lucky they weren't red, and it tried to stop. And when the camera pans up, it's actually a lorry that is carrying lots of traffic lights on the back that's probably going to a roadwork somewhere or some construction. It's just a great example of it not fully understanding the wider picture, the wider context. So why this matters is just making sure staff all understand that you've got to always fact check AI before using whatever it produces. Don't assume that AI knows what it's talking about. And you've got to be especially careful with specialized subjects, because the more niche the subject that you're talking to AI about or working on, the more likely it is that it's going to be wrong, because it's all based on the training data. And like I said, I've used a bad example. Paris is the capital of Italy. If you ask AI a question that's commonly, you know, the answers all over the internet, it's very, very likely AI will be correct, because the strength of the connections in the model in the background will be correct. But the more niche the topic, the more likely it is to be wrong. Making sure staff have the critical review skills needed to use AI systems. So you've got to make sure before using any AI output that you check all the facts. You know, like I've just mentioned, are the facts correct? Is it suitable for the students or whatever the use case is? Does it favour or disadvantage any group? I've done a whole other video, and I'll mention it in a minute, on the element of bias that can exist within data of AI. Does this make sense in our situation? You know, AI is generally, it generalizes the outputs, so you've got to make sure you turn it into something that's very specific for whatever you're using it for. And red flags to look out for are things like information you can't verify, obviously any stereotypes or anything like that, or advice that contradicts any professional training you've had. Just be very, very careful. So the way I would suggest going about this is making sure you go down a rule of AI suggests, humans decide. You know, it's humans must make the final decision about things like student grades, assessments, disciplinary action, anything that could have a general impact on the student, that's important. Humans have got to be in the loop. You know, you can't have any direct grading system where the students see the grades straight away. I've not seen any system that's accurate enough for that yet. And I don't believe that a lot of the systems that are doing grading, they're forcing humans to be in the loop. So they've got to clarify the grade before it goes off, because I think even them themselves know that it's not good enough yet. But I'd also argue humans aren't either. You know, I've worked for exam boards where I mark, and it is an impossible task, because humans mark differently and there's too much interpretation, however specific you make a mark scheme. And the last bit I finish with is this idea of just making sure it's your professional responsibility, that if you use something that AI has generated, you are responsible for that output. So, you know, AI is okay making it, but when you use it, that's on you. And it's making sure you can justify the decision to use any AI output that you have. Spotting and addressing bias is part of the literacy. It's understanding that bias can show up. I'll try and talk about this in not too much detail, because I've done a whole other video on it. But AI's obviously learned from everything on the internet, and this huge set of data has fed into bias. You know, there's bias on the internet, so there's bias in the AI outputs, and there's lots of reasons why that's the case. So the example I always use here is, I'll just show a couple of slides, is Bloomberg did a piece of research which I found fascinating, where they used image generation technology, which is trained on a lot of the same data, to when they first came out to generate pictures of people in different job roles, and then they analysed the genders and ethnicities and things like that of these people. They didn't say make a picture of a female lawyer. They just said draw me a picture of a lawyer, and then they saw what came out. And as you can see from these charts, the balance was disappointing. Now, it was the higher paying occupations were heavily male, and the lower paying occupations were heavily female. Now, that's a problem with the data, isn't it? You know, we've got, although that's also a problem with the world, we are hopefully further forward in that than we used to be. But the data that has fed these AIs is everything from history, and we've got to be careful of this bias not being perpetuated in everything we do with AI. This is the same data just showing you the same problem, but from an ethnicity point of view. We've got a real problem with the skin colours on the lower paying occupations being darker than those on the higher paying occupations, and we've got to be careful because this is easy to see this from a visual perspective, but this bias also exists in the text that AI generates and things like that, so we've just got to be careful. And this was the average faces that were generated. Now, I can't take any credit for this. I just found it incredibly interesting. This was Bloomberg that did this piece of research, and I think it was called The World According to AI. It was like what the world looked like for AI, and it was fascinating. You can find it online. So section 2, for simplicity, I think it's best to think of the classification system as a red, amber, green, or red, yellow, green system. So your green are the AIs that from a EU AI Act point of view you're okay with to go ahead. Now, I've got to add some disclosure to this, but I've put things like ChatGPT and Google Gemini in there as you're okay to go ahead with those. Now, that's assuming that you meet the age rules, and obviously it's also assuming it depends what you're using it for. You know, if you're using ChatGPT to grade students' work, that would become a high risk. I just mean technically you are okay to use the LLMs for lots of tasks. Now, you've got things in there I've put like translation tools and things like that. They're fine to use, but again, I'm not saying that you shouldn't check the output. I'm saying that the impact, the risk rating around the impact of the output is lower. You know, you mistranslate a document, it's not ideal and it could have an impact, but it's not quite the same level of risk as a grading system. So the green is you're allowed to use it just transparently and assuming it meets GDPR rules and age consent and things like that. You've then got the ones in the middle, which are your high risk. So these are the systems that could have an impact on the student's future if it's done wrong. So I've just picked 3 as an example. So if you as a school got a grading system in, like some really cool ones being developed at the minute, where they take a piece of work, they work with the exam boards and they actually grade student work, that would be classed as high risk, because obviously if that system was not performing correctly and it misgraded a piece of work, that could have a detrimental impact on the student's future. So that would be classed as high risk. And what you say with high risk is it's essential, and not that you shouldn't do it with green, but the human oversight is essential. You know, you've got to have the human in the loop. You've got to have a human clarifying the output, basically, and checking the output of everything that's high risk a lot more than you would have to with those that are slightly lower. Plagiarism checkers, you know, there's lots of these out there that say, you know, this is a 90% chance AI has generated this material. They are flawed. Now, not saying that they are a great indicator of plagiarism, but they aren't proof. And I've done a whole video on this, so I won't go into detail, but they aren't proof. They don't work that well, and they work better with some models than others and things like that. So they're a great indicator, but they are just an indicator. So you've got to check as a human that you're happy before you started saying somebody had cheated. And the adaptive learning platforms, I think they're going to be one of the biggest game changers in education. I think they already are, but I think we're not all adopting them yet. And I think with AI powered adaptive learning platforms, that it's going to be phenomenal. So they're the platforms where the students have an experience like answering questions, watching videos, things like that. But then the experience tailors to each individual student, and every student's pathway is different. I think they're going to be really important. But again, human have got to have an oversight on this, because if you pick the wrong platform, or you pick a platform that's fundamentally flawed, you could actually be damaging the student's learning experience, not adding value to it, which is the worry. And then the red ones at the top, they're the systems that are completely banned according to the EU AI Act. So across the EU, any AI that manipulates students, any AI that tries to read emotion from faces or voices or anything like that, those systems in schools are banned, quite rightly. I'm not aware of any schools in the EU doing that anyway, but but they would be banned as of 2025 when this act came out. So just to be really clear, the red zone, and I'll simplify this as much as I can, but the red zone is the completely banned systems. They are not to be used in schools. The alternative to that is, obviously, if you're trying to read emotion from faces, that's making sure you've got the direct feedback with the students and things like that. So red zone is banned systems. Yellow zone or amber zone, that is systems that you can do, but with very special care. So, make sure the human are always reviewing the output for any decisions and things like that. Be very transparent with its use with parents and students, and provide any ways to appeal any decision. Use it, but with caveats, with a fair few caveats. And then green is generally permitted, but obviously assuming it meets all other laws and things like that. And obviously when you're not using it in a situation where it would move it into high risk. So it sort of depends on the use as well. But I'm only thinking of that more for the LLMs, where they're quite open in terms of how they can be used. But again, it's important to be transparent. So tell students when they're using AI, that's mandatory. So if a student is interacting with AI, we've got to tell them it's AI. If you imagine, especially with some of the younger students, if there was an AI platform where they're allowed to use it based on the terms and conditions, are they emotionally developed enough to understand that they're talking to an AI, especially if it's voice and things like that? And we're going to get down the road of there'll be video. These AIs will have avatars and things like that. It's going to be quite a scary world. So we've got to be really careful about that. We've got to label any AI generated content we make. We can't pass things off as non-AI generated. And important, follow all the other age consent, GDPR, all that sort of stuff. But green is generally permitted. So section 3, linking this back to data and privacy. So it's just making sure, although this isn't part of the EU AI Act, I think there's a lot of overlap here and people are misunderstanding some of this. So I just thought I'd highlight it in a couple of slides. So the EU AI Act doesn't replace other laws. So for ChatGPT and similar tools, you still need GDPR compliance. You still need parental consent for students. And I've put students under 13, I mean under 18. 13 to 18 is parental consent needed. You obviously still got to adhere by any sort of internal school acceptable use policies and things like that. Might have to have age verification. There's a lot of things that technically you still need, but from an EU AI Act point of view, ChatGPT could be allowed, but then there might be other issues. So just because the EU AI Act says you can use it transparently, GDPR says, but only with proper consent and data protection. Data protection with some tools like ChatGPT could be a problem because the data is potentially getting sent to America. Depending on what account you're using and how you're using it, that could be a problem. And it might even be training the AI model, which could be a big problem. And then also there might be school policy. So it's just making sure you understand that we've got to check this over more than just the EU AI Act. So data protection essentials. So this is the golden rules for student data and AI is to never put personal student data into AI tools. Now, there are some tools that are data safe. So they're training AI models that they're using are trained. It doesn't matter where they're trained. They are running on servers in the EU. So that means your data isn't leaving the EU. And then it's also about making sure that it's not feeding the training of the model. So it's not retaining any of the prompts that you put in. So it's generating the output, but it's not changing the brain. So that is that is important. But the golden rule is, even if you're using a data safe system, really for any system, it's easier just to remember, don't put personal data in, just because it's an extra level of protection, and it's simpler to teach staff, because otherwise you've got to teach them which systems are safe and which aren't. Don't upload student work to public AI systems. I think this is a problem some schools will have with any of the potential like grading systems. Should they start looking into these grading systems, which do look very powerful, some schools will have a problem with the intellectual property of student work. So technically, are you allowed as a teacher to upload a piece of work that you didn't write to a tool to save you time? Now, it depends on the school and it depends on your approach to this, but this will be a problem in some schools, that you don't own that work, so you shouldn't be allowed to upload it, especially if that, say, system is running in America. You have no rights potentially to send that data to America when it's not even yours in the first place. So be careful about that. And when in doubt, anonymize any data if you're unsure, or just don't use AI. If you're in doubt, don't breach rules, and especially around GDPR and things like that. So be careful. When it comes to systems, because these, before using any AI tool, I've just talked about, check where the data goes, does it learn from the work, those type of things. But the red flags is if you look at a system and it says things like, we use your data to improve our AI, that's a red flag. If they've got vague privacy policies, it's a red flag. Or if the data is stored or sent outside the EU without protection, that's a huge red flag. So be very careful about these things. Now, the last couple of sections are much shorter. So the role-specific guidance based on the EU AI Act is just highlighting a few things. So teachers, it's not banning you. You are allowed to use AI for idea generation, content generation, worksheet generation, things like that. If you use it for anything like plagiarism checking, grading, anything that's more impactful on the student outcome, it's classed as high risk. So you just got to make sure you've got full human oversight of the output before it gets to the student. What this means for support staff, so very similar. Support staff have got to be a bit extra careful with a lot of the systems they might be interacting, could be like the large MIS data systems that run schools. So we've got to be very careful. We're checking where the data's going, checking the AI recommendations before acting, because they could be more impactful, but it depends. IT staff have obviously got to maintain records of AI systems that the schools use and make sure they're all risk assessed and graded. Library and learning support, I've just kind of put helping the students understand when they're using AI and identifying bias and things like that. I think we've got a real big responsibility that's on giving the AI literacy to the students. I mean, the EU AI Act is a brilliant piece of legislation, but it's not designed for schools. It impacts schools, but it applies to everything. So there is a lack of finer detail about how it impacts schools or what schools should do. For leadership, make sure all staff receive AI training like this, the key AI literacy stuff. Keep records of what systems use, have clear policies, have a complaints procedure, that type of thing. Now, this one is the bit that's going to cause debate. Okay, so Section 5 is about transparency. So there's some very clear parts of the EU AI Act that talk about the importance of being transparent and the need to be transparent. Now, the question is, while both sides of this scale are very clear, the bit in the middle isn't, and there's not the finer detail. Now, I know what I would do, and I'll share my views on this, but it's more about deciding as a school where you sit on some of this. So in terms of declaration, so what we mean by that is declaring where AI has generated a piece of content, making sure you're saying, if you email parents, AI wrote this letter, that type of thing. There's rules on whether you do and do not need to do that. So on one side of the scale, you've got declaration required. So that is if AI generates any content from scratch, full worksheets, full lessons, full assessment, etc. If students are interacting with AI, you've got to make sure that that's declared. If AI influences any decision about students, grading, feedback, anything like that. What was the other one? Plagiarism detection, things like that. You've got to make sure, AI has come up with this 98% rating, whatever. You've got to declare it. Now, on the other side of the scale, you've got the very low level use. So if AI has polished something that you've already made, so it's just made it that little bit better, if it translates or reformats your work, if it's basic spelling and grammar checking, you don't need to declare. We've never gone around telling everybody we've been using spell check in the past. That's not changed. So I think both sides of those scales are very clear. It's the bit in the middle, which unfortunately is where a lot of work actually takes place. We don't often get AI generating things completely from scratch, but we're often not at the other end of the scale either, where we've done 99% of the work, it finishes it off. So what my advice would be is you need to come up with a school policy. Every school should have a clear school policy on this. Now, to deal with the middle, the two sides you can't change by school policy. The two sides on what you should and shouldn't declare is set by the EU AI Act, and they're relatively clear on that. It's the middle ground. So if, for example, you used AI as a thinking partner to develop ideas, do you need to declare that? At what level, at what point does it change on the scale from being something that doesn't need declaration to needing declaration? If AI is helping you explore and refine your ideas, are they your ideas or have they become AI's ideas? And I've put when in doubt, ask leadership, but my gut says most schools leadership won't know the answer to this, because I feel like I'm relatively read up on this area and I'm not crystal clear. So a couple of examples. Do I need to tell students if AI helped me write this worksheet? Okay, so do I need to tell students? And I've put in, these are my opinions, only if AI created the content. If AI just help polish your existing ideas, no, because that would be on that first side of the scale. This is quite clear. You don't need to do it if AI's polished something you've already done. What about report writing? Now, this is the one that creates a lot of debate with AI assistants. So I've put, if you form the opinions and AI just helps phrase it better, no. So in my opinion, this would come down to more of a grammar, proofreading, spell check type thing. However, this is if you're forming the opinions. Now, this is where you've got to be really careful. If you give AI, obviously all anonymized, depending on what tool you're using and things like that. If you give AI lots of observations about students and it helped you phrase those in a professional way to go to parents, at that point, AI hasn't generated any ideas. It's helped you phrase your ideas and your observations better in a more professional way. To me, that doesn't need declaration. However, if you don't give it enough opinions and you don't give it the information about the student, the personalised information that you need in a report, that's where AI will start making stuff up. At that point, declaration will be needed because AI has started generating opinions, so to speak. So this is where it's very difficult. It depends how you're using AI. If you're using it well and you're not being lazy, all it's doing is really helping you pick the right words. That's not a declaration. That's not needed. But obviously, there's the other side of that scale as well. So this is why it's not clear cut. If students are using AI for research, always declare. Definitely. If it's something to do with students, they need to know when they're using AI. If you're asking them to use a platform, etc. What's the difference between AI helping and AI creating? Again, there's no clear answer for this. I've sort of thought, if you ask yourself, would this content exist in a similar form without AI? Is it helping you generate something that you already had the ideas for, or how much of a part is it played? This is a question that's very difficult to answer. At what point does this tip the scale? So that, I appreciate that's not clear cut, the transparency section, but I'm trying to be honest with you about how difficult this is going to be. I think a natural solution to this for a school would be to explain the types of use cases to parents, that teachers be transparent about the type of ways your teachers might use AI, and share that as part of coming to the school. And then you've been transparent in terms of the AI use cases. And I think that should be clear, that we should all be honest, like we're honest if we use a book or use the internet. We just need to be transparent. It's like academic honesty, but for teachers, it's just being honest. That's how I'd play it. So this last bit is just a bit about implementation. So what do we tell families we should, as a school, when you've got your ducks in a row, you should be comfortable telling families that you're using AI responsibly to enhance learning. You're only trying to use it in ways you genuinely think it adds value. Your child's privacy and rights are protected. You've took a lot of care over making sure you're using the right systems. You're teaching staff how to not share data in the wrong way. Humans will always make the final decision. Anything important that could impact your child, humans are have final oversight of anything before it hits the child. And obviously be open to the parents asking questions and raising concerns. And then I've just said communication tip, be proactive, not reactive. Deal with this now and set the framework up right for the next few years that are going to be a bit rocky, because this technology is developing very, very fast. Red flags, make sure that you share with staff, if they feel that there's a system that says it's starting to read emotions, if they're unsure if an AI tool is compliant, they contact leadership straight away. If parents complain, if an AI system makes a decision you think is wrong, we've got to try and keep on top of that. And the only way we're going to do that is getting feedback from the staff. And the next steps, depending on where you're at in your journey with this, you're meant to risk assess every AI platform that is being used in your school. That's not a small job, depending on your school, and you'd be amazed how many systems actually now say they've got AI in, and we have a legal responsibility to risk assess any system where there's AI use in a school, especially all of them, but especially when they start touching students. Any one where a student is interacting with an AI platform has to be risk assessed to an extra level of detail. And obviously do the annual training with staff, the refreshers. It's really important, and the refreshers have never been more important probably than AI, in the sense of the pace of change. There could be some huge changes over the course of a year. A year's a long time in technology. So that's my sort of intro to the EU AI Act. Hopefully that's useful for anybody that feels a little bit lost with it. It's an amazing piece of legislation that's very innovative in the time it came out and things like that, but the repercussions on schools are bigger than most schools appreciate in terms of workload involved. So hopefully that's helped break it down a little bit for you.